They say death brings families together, but for me, it ripped mine apart in the cruelest way imaginable. I thought losing my father was the hardest pain I would ever endure, but I was wrong. That pain was only the beginning. The real heartbreak came when I discovered that the very person who was supposed to stand beside me in my grief, the one I trusted most, was the one who betrayed me in the deepest, most unforgivable way. I still remember the way the air felt that morning, thick, heavy, suffocating in a way that warned me something was even before the words left my brother's lips. The sun was streaming through the lace curtains of my living room, soft and golden, but it only mocked me, because inside that glow, inside what should have been a peaceful moment of quiet reflection after my father's funeral, my entire world came. When my brother walked in that day, his voice carried an arrogance I had never heard before. His smile stretched too wide, his eyes burned with something almost cruel, and his words sliced through me with a precision I will never forget. "It's all mine now," as if those 4 words were a crown placed on his. At first, I thought I had misheard him. I blinked, waiting for some explanation, something that would make sense, because my father had promised me that his estate, the home he built with his own hand, the business he poured his soul, the legacy he'd for us both, would be shared equally. He told me more than once, sometimes holding my hand, sometimes looking me dead in the eye, "You'll be taken care of." I made sure, but those promises dissolved into dust. My brother had found a way, through manipulation and to rewrite the future. With falsified papers, twisted words, and a sickening smile, he claimed every acre of land, every account my father had spent decades, every memory that was supposed to secure my stability. The kind of greed that betrayal didn't hit. It crawled through me slowly, like poison seed. At first, the darkest days, shock gave way to, because this wasn't just about. I wept for days, curling into itself as if I could somehow protect my heart from shattering completely. I wept not only for the inheritance that was stolen, but for the father who was no longer here to protect me from the son he had trusted. But grief is a dangerous thing. It doesn't stay pure for long. Like stagnant water, it begins to rot into anger. And soon that anger boiled inside me until I could barely breathe. I thought about the smirk on my brother's face, the casual way he had dismissed me, as if my pain was nothing more, as if I were a weak and he could trample under. He humiliated me, not just in private, but in front of extended family, pretending not to notice, too afraid of conflict or too greedy to stand by me. Their silence was as sharp as his, cutting me down. Humiliation burned. It scorched my veins, turned my cheeks red. And yet, beneath the fire, something began to grow. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was the first spark of something I hadn't felt in resolve. He may have taken everything, but he had not taken me. The days that followed were long. I wandered through the empty house, could no longer call, running my fingers across the wooden banister polished by hand, smelling the faint trace of his whisper to the walls. Revenge didn't feel as I tried to hold on. He strutted through my head down. The pitiful sister, he basked in admiration, but humiliation, and mine came one late, staring at my brother's laughter, mingling with my chest tight, my eyes stung, but in that crushing moment, I could no longer remain, disappeared into shadows. No, I would fight. Not with fists, not with begging, not with tears, but with something sharper, stronger, and far more enduring. I would fight with truth, with patience, with strategy. That was the night I made a vow not whispered in grief, but spoken with fire. My brother thought he had silenced me forever, but he had only awakened something far more dangerous. I knew then I couldn't let him walk away with my life's legacy, and if he thought his betrayal was the end of the story, he was about to learn it was only the beginning. Before the lies, there was laughter. I can still hear the echoes, soft and innocent, carried on the wind like the scent of cut grass. My brother and I weren't always. In fact, for the longest time, there was a time when we were inseparable, bound together by secrets whispered in the dark, by adventures in the woods behind, and by the simple, unshakable belief that family meant. Those memories, once golden, have grown sharp with time, because now I see them. They are no longer just, they are evidence of how we grew up in a modest home, the kind where we were royalty, or at least that's how it felt to me. But children see what they want. Looking back now, my brother, even as a boy, hated. When my father praised my drawings, my brother would sulk in the corner. When I got the bigger slice, his eyes would darken. At the time, I dismissed it as, don't all siblings fight over. I told myself it was harmless, a phase he would. But now, as I replay, I recognize them. The early cracks bond I thought was a. One summer stands out. We must have been around 10, My father had promised to teach how to swim in the lake. I remember how clinging to his arm, laughing as though my brother was there too. Still see the look in his eye. Later that day, when no one was watching, he pushed me under the water and held me there longer than he. It wasn't a game. It was a warning, though I didn't understand it then. When I came up gasping for air, he laughed and pretended it was just rough play. And because I loved him, because I couldn't fathom malice in my own brother, I believed him. But deep down, a part of me knew. That moment lodged itself in my memory like a splinter I couldn't pull out. As we grew older, those small acts of jealousy turned sharper. He started taking things that belonged to me, my books, my clothes, even the attention of friends who came. He had a way of twisting situations, making me look like the selfish one, the spoiled one, the one who didn't deserve what she. My parents would scold us both, urging peace, but I always walked away with the sting of guilt, while he walked away with the satisfaction of the betrayal. I now did not begin with it began in those childhood moments. My brother never truly. He wanted what was mine. That was the difference between us. I was content to. He was determined to, and yet I loved him. That's the bitter truth that gnaws. Even when he pushed me, even when he stole my favorite necklace and claimed he found it on the ground days later, even when he whispered lies about friends so that they would. I loved him. I defended him. I told myself he was. I wanted to believe. I ignored the splint. What hurts most is realizing, sharpening him, and waiting for the. Because I clung to the hope who once was still somewhere. And in those memories, I now see the signs that told me but envy, dress, disguise. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a storm gathering just beyond the walls, waiting to crash down. Every tick of the grandfather clock seemed louder than the last as we sat in the lawyer. My family lined up like soldiers. My father's will was about to be read, and though grief hung heavy in the air, I clung to one fragile piece. My father had promised me the leather chairs, and the air smelled. My father's lawyer. Instead, his voice was even. Every word carried. At first, everything sounded as he spoke of them with the love my father. And then the words shifted. He read clauses and allocations lines that made no sense, sentences that cut me open, because suddenly it wasn't to be shared equally between my beloved. It was to be passed in full to my son, my brother. His name written there like a. I sat up straighter. My breath caught. Surely there had been. My father would never leave me. I turned to look at my brother, and that smug, triumphant curl of his. This wasn't a mistake. This was his doing. Shock paralyzed me as a lawyer. His monotone voice sliced. My brother had manipulated the will. Whether it was through charm, deceit, or forged paper, I didn't know yet, but I knew with every fiber of my being that this was not what my father, who had held my hand and promised me security, had not abandoned me. My brother had stolen. The air around me grew heavier as the lawyer read the final line. My inheritance, my security, just like that. And not in private, not behind closed doors, but in front of cousins, family, friends. All of them gathered there, all of them watched. Their eyes shifted toward me, some with pity, some with judgment, some with thinly veiled sadness. To them, I was suddenly less the sister who had been cast, the daughter left with no. Humiliation burned hot, my cheeks flushed. Throat ached, and I could feel the sting of tears gathering, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. My brother leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest like a man who had just won a long-fought battle. He looked at me once briefly, and in his eyes was a silent message. You lost. I won. Stay down. The grief of losing my father had been crushing enough, but this betrayal cut deeper. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about dignity. It was about my place in the family. My brother had stolen not just my inheritance, but my identity as my father's daughter. He had taken the legacy meant to bind us together and twisted it into a weapon to sever me from everything I. Whispers rippled through the room. Some relatives murmured about how the son should inherit more. Others wondered aloud if I had done something. The lies settled into their minds like seeds, and I knew those seeds would grow. Soon, I wouldn't just be the daughter without an inheritance. I would be the daughter with a stain on her reputation. That was the brilliance of my brother's cruelty. He hadn't only taken my future, he had made me look undeserving of it. The humiliation crushed me. I wanted to scream, to stand and tell them all the truth, to insist that my father had loved me and wanted me. But my voice was locked in my throat, strangled by the weight of. My hands trembled in my lap, those official-looking sheets that bore false words that I. And then came but for the the boy I once, a man who saw family, a man who would rather destroy me than share. That realization hurt, But as the grief clawed at me, anger began. It rose slowly, pride creeping in, each smug glance, each pitying look. I gathered them all and fed them into the... I refused to believe my father. I refused to believe I was... And in that moment, I felt the first truth. Because betrayal may break your heart, but it also... My brother thought he had crushed me so completely that he was wrong. I left that room hollow. But even in that emptiness, something darker had been planted. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I would find a way, not just for my memory. But his biggest mistake was thinking I'd stay silent. While I struggled to survive, he celebrated like a king. The weeks after the will reading passed like a cruel parade, each day another reminder of what I had lost and what he had gained. My brother didn't hide his victory. He displayed it like a trophy for the whole world to see. Where I carried grief like a stone in my chest, he carried arrogance like a crown on his head. And the worst part was how easily people accepted it, as though his wealth had erased his sins and made him someone worthy of admiration. I remember the first time I parked outside the estate that had once been my home, the same driveway. Instead of that my brother leaned against their admiration. It wasn't just soon came the tailor, the dinners at he wore wealth like his relatives who had whispered behind their hands now stood proudly, basking in. They praised him for. Meanwhile, the money I had managed to bills piled up on my small kitchen. I often found myself meals just to make it. My modest apartment felt a far cry from the... I would walk through the grocery store, counting coins in my palm, while my brother posted. The grief I felt for my father turned into something more poisonous. I thought of the promises, the security he had sworn, and the way my brother had twisted them into nothing. I thought of how I sat in silence at the will reading, choking on humiliation, while my brother smirked at me. Those memories fueled the fire of jealousy, but more than that, because this wasn't envy for... This was fury for something that was stolen from... And the world reward. That was the deepest cut. People praised his generosity when he donated, never realizing he gave away money. They applauded his business sense. Expanded my father's company, never knowing he had stolen it. They admired his new circle of friends, his polished smile, his confident walk, all of it built on the foundation of betrayal. And I had to watch, powerless, as he played the role of the successful son while I was reduced to whispers of pity or scorn. Humiliation became my daily companion. I ran into old family friends at the grocery store, their eyes darting away when they saw me, as if my pain were contagious. One woman even had the nerve to say, "Well, maybe your father knew what he was doing. Maybe he trusted your brother more." Her words stung like acid, not because they were true, but because they confirmed what I already, that the world would believe him, not me. Yet even in the depths of that humiliation, something inside me hardened. Each whispered judgment, each smug display from my brother, it all became fuel to carry my anger differently, not as a wound, but as a... Quietly, I started to study. I noted his habits. He surrounded himself, the cracks in the perfect image. I forced myself to play the part of, even as I planned for. But the truth was, tired of crying myself, tired of waking up to an empty apartment, tired of watching my brother bask glow of riches. That some nights I would sit at my small kitchen, staring at, imagining his last. Spoke of the grand. They marveled at the diamond ring, the guest list to be the wedding of the year, a spectacle so dazzling, not only as a wealthy. When I first heard the news, the thought of him basking in almost instantly that something cold, because in that moment, the perfect state. If my brother thought he had buried me, his wedding wouldn't be his triumph, the perfect but instead, for the briefest moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Guilt. The introduction happened at a dinner party my brother arranged, a glittering spectacle designed to showcase his wealth and his future bride. I didn't want to attend. The thought of sitting across from him, pretending everything was normal, felt unbearable. But curiosity, and maybe something darker, pulled me there. If I was going to bring down his wedding, I needed to see the woman who would stand at his side when I finally tore his world apart. The restaurant was one of those upscale places with chandeliers dripping crystals and waiters gliding silently between tables. I felt out of place the moment I walked in. My modest dress, a sharp contrast to the glittering outfits of my brother, thrived in places like... I could see it in the way he held himself, confident and shaking hands with men who only noticed him once he... And then there she was. She walked in on his arm, and for a moment the room to bend toward her, not because of wealth, but because of something softer. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't her beauty that disarmed. It was her warmth. She had the kind of smile that felt unpracticed, genuine, the kind that reached her. When she greeted me, she didn't look at me with pity or disdain. She looked at me as if I mattered. It threw me off balance. I had prepared myself to despise her, to see her as another thief. But instead, I felt my She asked me about my life, not in a shallow way, but as if she cared about the end. She listened when I said, eyes focused, giving me more attention than for the first time since my... Because if she was innocent, if she had no idea of the lie, I watched her, not realizing that I saw the way she touched. Or had he lied? The more I thought about it, anger still, not fully. It was him, my brother, who took everything, left me broken, who now stood beside this woman, cloaked in respectability. She was his shield, his crown, his final act of triumph. But what if she didn't deserve to be ruined? That thought crept in like an unwelcome guest. I hated it, because it complicated everything. Revenge had been my fuel, my anchor, the only thing that kept me from drowning in grief. But now, staring at her kind eyes and warm smile, I felt something dangerously. As the evening stretched on, I excused myself from and stepped outside. The city lights sparkled against the night sky, and the sound of laughter from inside the restaurant. My chest felt tight. I leaned against the railing. I wanted clarity, but all I felt was What is? All of this, said, motioning toward. Sometimes I feel like I can't. Her honesty startled. It was the first crack in the perfect image. She wasn't as comfortable in the... She was struggling too. And in that moment, a flicker of connection. Two women standing, both suffocating. But that flicker quickened to suspicion. If she was struggling, trying to read the truth, there was something hidden. We stood in silence, and then she said, sometimes I wonder. The words hit me. She didn't know. Or maybe she did. She was too afraid to face it. Either way, she was... The realization twisted. If she had doubts about him, she was hiding something, then she wasn't as innocent. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She had her own card. I walked back into the night, more unsettled, because now my revenge wasn't just tangled in the lies of my brother. It was tangled in her too. And that's when I realized the bride-to-be, she was hiding a secret. Blood may be... If grief is heavy, but when betrayal cuts, it doesn't just... It poisons every bond, until even love... That's what I learned in the weeks after. Brother's fiancé. I had thought the inheritance was the only thing stolen from me, but soon I realized something worse had been taken. My place in my own family. It started quietly, with whispers that reached me long after they were spoken. An aunt telling a neighbor that I had been difficult. A cousin shrugging and saying, maybe my father had his... These words traveled back to me, echoes bouncing off walls, faint but sharp enough to... I began to notice the way people looked at me when I... Pity mixed with judgment, the kind of look reserved who had somehow brought... Then came the sharper blow. At a family gathering, and raised his glass to praising him for and dedication. The words made me want to scream. My father's legacy hadn't been carried on. It had been stolen. But as I looked around the table, I realized no one else seemed to care. They smiled, they clapped, they nodded in approval. To them, my brother was a success story. To me, he was a thief. And then, when the toast ended, another relative turned to me with a pointed smile and said, maybe if you had been more responsible, your father would have trusted you with more. The words hit me harder than I expected. It was as if the humiliation of the will reading had followed me, spreading like wildfire, until even the people they didn't see a daughter robbed of her. They saw a woman who was... Loneliness settled over me. I tried to reach out to the few relatives who had once been close to me, but they avoided my calls, offered excuses when I suggested meet, or spoke to me with clipped polite. My brother had money and had the power to read not only legal documents, but memories. He painted me as bitter. The isolation, I began to question myself. I was wrong. If maybe I had misremembered. Late at night, I would replay conversation, trying to catch every nuance. Had I imagined it? Had I built my hope on something that... The doubt gnawed at me, threatening to unravel. And then came the anger. It wasn't the wild, burning anger I had felt before. This was deeper, colder. It sat in my stomach like ice, spreading slowly, methodically. It wasn't just anger at my brother anymore. It was anger at the family who had abandoned me, who had chosen comfort. Their betrayal stung almost as much as his, because I had believed family meant loyalty, even in the darkest time. But now I understood. Everything else could be bought. The weight of it all finally broke me one. I was alone in my apartment, bills scattered across, my father's photo propped against the wall. I stared at his face, at the warmth in his eyes, and I wept until my body, until I could barely breathe, until I thought the grief consumed me entirely. It was the kind of breakdown that leaves you emptied of, but in that empty, because once you've been broken, once you've lost, if they wanted to worship, because I knew the truth. One evening, I hadn't meant to linger as I sipped my coffee, voices that made it was my aunt and my half swallowed by. At first, my mind was too heavy, weighed down, but then I heard my ears sharpen. What I caught was fragmented. They spoke about something he was desperate to, warning that if my aunt hushed were vague, my brother had secrets and suddenly, the loneliness didn't feel so suffocating because now I had. That night, as I walked home with my brother's empire wasn't built on strength, and I had just heard the first. When his wedding invitation arrived, I laughed, for the first time in months. It was a sound that startled even me, brittle and sharp, a laugh that didn't carry joy but something darker, something that tasted like ashes and fire. The envelope had been hand-delivered, thick and heavy with embossed gold lettering. My name, written in elegant calligraphy, glared up at me as if daring me to open it. For a moment, I simply stared at it, my chest tight, my fingers trembling. And then I broke the seal, and there it was, an invitation to the grandest event of the year, my brother's wedding. The audacity of it made my blood boil. After stealing my inheritance, after humiliating me in front of family, after parading his wealth through town like a crown, he had the nerve to send me It wasn't kindness, it wasn't duty, it was arrogance, a deliberate reminder that he had everything, and I had nothing. He wanted me there, sitting quietly, forced to watch himself, forced to smile while he stood at the altar, basking in. It was salt in my wounds, and for a moment, my mind filled with image, surrounded by people. I imagined my brother's trying. I win again. But then, something shifted. That brittle laugh, and with it came a realization. He wanted me there. He wanted me to. What he didn't realize had given me something. He had given me an opportunity. A stage he had built himself with all the pomp. A stage that would all of them together. And if I chose, it could also be the stage. The thought grew. For months I had. But now, for the first time since the will was read, he had created the perfect setback, and he didn't even That night, I placed the invitation on my kitchen and stared at it. My small apartment was for the hum of the refrigerator, but inside my mind, every insult fueling me, the image of his bride's kind, complicating everything. But the weight of my father's promise and the sting of betrayal. I thought of my family, the ones who toasted him while I thought of the way they looked at me as if I were less than, as if my father's love hadn't been mine too. I wanted them to see the truth. I wanted them to witness his mask shatter, and what better place than the altar he had built to glorify himself? The first seeds of my plan began to take shape that night. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew the foundation. I would attend that wedding, not as the humiliated sister he expected, but as the storm he never saw coming. The days that followed were different from the weeks of despair. I carried myself with the heaviness of grief was still there, but beneath it pulsed a current of determination. I began to imagine the ways the documents the whispers I could turn into what. I remembered the conversation I had overheard in the cabin, the secret my relatives trying so desperately. I began to watch more closely, gathering information where my brother's routine, his careless words at parties, the way people spoke about him. I wasn't rushing. Revenge couldn't. It had to be delivered and now I had a date a deadline that was. Sometimes doubt crept in. I would picture his fiancés. Would I be distracted? The thought twisted. But then I would remember the smug curl of my after spilling from the doubt would justice for been humiliated, justice for Ruth buried beneath. One evening I pulled the invitation. From that moment, no longer filled with each time the image that my brother standing at the altar. The thought didn't just come, but now my brother had hand, and from that moment, designing his downfall. If he thought his secrets were safe, he underestimated me. Revenge doesn't happen in a single moment. It begins in the shadows, in silence, with patience as your greatest weapon. I knew I couldn't simply walk into his wedding and scream accusations. That would only make me look bitter, unstable, the exact image he had painted for the world. If I wanted to strike, I needed proof. Cold, undeniable, damning proof. And I was willing to dig through every corner of his life to find it. I started small. Bank statements, old files from my father's business that I still had copies, receipts tucked away in drawers, overlooked emails from. At first, it felt like sifting through ashes, fragments of a world I no longer. But slowly, patterns emerged, payments that did, transfers to accounts, expenses that reeked of extravagance but were business cards. My brother hadn't just stolen from me, he had stolen from my father's company, from the very foundation of the empire. The deeper I went, the darker it became. I found evidence of backdoor deals, contracts signed under questionable circumstances, and invoices that didn't align. He was skimming money, moving it around, building an illusion of success while hollowing out the very legacy. The inheritance theft. What he was doing now was bigger, riskier. Each discovery lit a fire. I spent long nights at my kitchen table, papers spread across the glow of a single lamp. I began to dig in, patient enough to listen. I spoke casually to employees, even neighbors near. Each conversation, a rumor, a suspicion. There was the neighbor who mentioned once he were alone these, but together they pain of sins too heavy to ignore. I didn't know yet how I would use it, but I knew one thing. When the moment came, I would have evidence strong enough to shatter him completely. Still, the work took its toll. Each discovery was a wound reopened. Every lie I uncovered reminded me of the brother I had lost, the boy I once believed in. There were nights when I wept, overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. Nights when the grief threatened to drown me again. But then I would look at the invitation on my table, or hear the whispers of my family praising him, and my tears would harden into determination. He had chosen this path, not me, and I would not allow his lies to stain. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how far he had fallen. It wasn't just greed, it was desperation. He wasn't content with what he had stolen. He was always reaching for more, always building higher walls of deceit to protect himself. And walls like that eventually collapse. All it takes is the right push. One evening, after weeks of digging, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden within a pile of financial statements was a transaction that didn't belong. It wasn't just suspicious, it was dangerous. Money funneled to an account overseas, connected to a name I didn't. At first, I thought it was just another attempt to hide his fraud. But the more I researched, the clearer it became. This wasn't just theft. This was criminal. My brother wasn't just a greedy heir. He was laundering money. The realization hit me like a blow. This wasn't about me anymore. This wasn't about the inheritance or the humiliation or even the wedding. What I had stumbled upon could destroy him far beyond family wisdom. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just end his marriage. It could end his freedom. I sat frozen at my table, the papers trembling in the weight of what I had discovered. Part of me felt fear of what it meant, fear of what would happen if I moved forward. But another part of me, a darker part, felt something close to exhilaration, because for the first time I held something he couldn't charm his way out of, something no amount of wealth could cover up. The inheritance theft had broken me, the humiliation had me, but this was my weapon. I gathered the documents carefully, tucking them into the growing file. My hands still shook, my mind racing, but one thought cut through the chaos with sharp clarity. This was bigger than me, bigger than our family, bigger than the stolen leg, because what I found next would destroy more than just. She wasn't as innocent. When I first met my brother's bride-to-be, I told myself she was. Her smile was warm, her kindness so genuine I questioned my resolve. She had seemed untouched by my brother's error, as though she had wandered into his orbit by accident. But innocence is a mask, and masks always slip if you watch closely enough. My investigation into my brother had already uncovered enough to topple his empire. Fraud, manipulation, and now money laundering. The evidence was stacked high. But as I dug deeper, threads began to appear that didn't belong to him alone. There were connections, names, transactions, whispers that pointed not only to him, but to her. At first, I dismissed them. I wanted to. I told myself she was collateral damage, a woman caught in his lies, no more guilty than I had been when I believed in. But curiosity has a way of eroding excuses, and soon I found myself following those, and what I uncovered made my blood run cold. Her family wasn't what they on the surface, business owners, people who moved comfortably, but beneath that surface was her father's company. Her brother had been linked, and there were rumors that their wealth through hard work. She had been involved in buried under a charity fund, funds that were officially she was cleared of wrong. Unofficially, whispers said. I stared at the documents. She wasn't in it, but like my brother, and now they had souls dressed in. The revelation hit me hard. Wondered if I would be tearing apart, but now I pieced together her history. I felt that guilt. Maybe I wasn't. I was exposing something, and yet the conflict inside. Because even if she was guilty, even if her family, the wedding was. It was more than just two. It was two families, two legacies. My revenge wouldn't just topple my brother. It could scorch her family. Was I ready for that? Could I bear the weight of this? I wrestled with the questions night after, pacing my apartment, staring at my father's voice haunted me. His promises, his belief in fairness, his hope for unity. Would he have wanted this? Would he have wanted me to burn not only my brother, but everyone tied to him? Or would he have told me to walk away, to leave the past buried? But then I would remember the humiliation, the whispers of relatives calling me bitter, irresponsible, unworthy. The sight of my brother's smirk as the will was read, the laughter spilling from the estate while I stood outside in the cold. The world had already buried me alive. Why should I protect theirs? Each time the answer became clearer. Guilt was a luxury I could no longer afford. Justice demanded more. So I continued to dig. I followed the money trails, the hidden connections, the favors exchanged behind closed doors. The deeper I went, the more entangled the bride's family became with my brother's schemes. It was almost poetic. Two families, both rotten beneath their polished surfaces, joining together in a spectacle meant to dazzle the world. The irony was bitter. While guests would gather to celebrate their union, toasting their success, I would know the truth. Their foundations were built on lies that I now had to. Still, the weight pressed heavily on me. I dreamed of her sometimes, her kind smile twisting into something darker. In those dreams, she looked at me not with innocence, but with knowing, as if she had torn between. The truth was, but that didn't matter any, because innocence or guilt, kindness or cruelty, she had chosen to bind her life to him, and by doing so, she had chosen to. I began to see the wedding not just as his stage, but as theirs. Two liars standing, cloaked in white, waiting in the shadows with the power to rip the veil. My plan grew sharper with each. I added her family secrets, layering them. If one truth didn't destroy them, another. I didn't know yet, but I knew the effect would be their empire, respectability, perfect image. It would all collapse. And in the quiet of the night, when doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the cost didn't matter, and yet I couldn't. The wedding had to burn. The night before his wedding, I stood in front of the mirror, not as his sister, but as his reckoning. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Midnight had long passed, but sleep was impossible. My table was covered in papers, photographs, and notes, weeks of work, months of pain, distilled into one thick file that sat before me like a weapon. Every page carried proof of his deceit. Forged contracts, missing funds, shady business deals, secrets he thought would never see the light of day. I had gathered it all, piece by piece, like shards of glass from a shattered mirror, and now it was ready. Tomorrow, the world would see him for what he truly was. I walked to the mirror, my reflection pale in the dim light. For a long moment, I simply stared, searching my. Who was I now? Not the grieving daughter I had been when not the broken sister I had been when the will was read, not the humiliated out. Those versions of me. In their place stood someone forged by into something unbreakable. But as I traced the edge, doubt slipped. Was this justice? My father had believed it. Would he have wanted me to take this, or would he have begged me to live without revenge? The question gnawed at me, heavy and I turned back to the table, my hand resting on the evidence was undeniable. If I revealed it, there would my brother's life, his reputation. There was no way to separate. The bride's family had. If I pulled the thread for a fleeting moment, guilt pressed me, sharp and I pictured her face. But then, the scandals. Then returned to the mirror. My reflection seemed different now, stronger. The lines of pain were still etched into my face, but beneath them there was fire. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing to strike. The hours slipped by slowly. I packed my bag with the evidence, each document neatly stacked, organized for maximum impact. I rehearsed my words, not out loud, but in my head, crafting the sentences that would pierce like daggers when every scenario, and still beneath a small voice whispered. The thought chilled me. This time was different. This time I had proof, and no amount of his lie. As dawn crept close, I stood once more. My eyes were steady now, my hands no longer. I thought of my father, of the promises of the legacy he, and I whispered, tomorrow they'll all. Slipped into bed in my dreams, not as a celebration. Rows of guests dressed in faces turned toward the altar. Their eyes wide. I saw my brother's expression, and I woke with us. The morning of the wedding would, and with it, my chance to find not the money, not the estate. Tomorrow the world would see. It was the kind of wedding the kind I was about. The morning sun shone, glinting off the white stone step. A warm breeze carried the scent. Thousands of them, but perfect people stared. The jealous sister, the bitter outcast, was here to burn their illusions to the ground. Inside, the cathedral was breathtaking. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the marble floors in shades of crimson and blue. Candles flickered on every surface, their flames steady and serene. The altar was draped in white, gold ribbons twined around every column, and at its center stood a towering arch of roses so flawless it seemed unreal. It was the kind of beauty people spent lifetimes chasing, the kind that belonged in magazines and fairy tales. Guests filled the pews, their voices a low murmur of I scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces, relatives who had turned their backs on me, friends who now acted like people who had chosen to bask in my. They laughed and smiled, oblivious to the convinced they were in a perfect union. And then I saw my brother stood near the altar, radiant and confidence dripped from him. Every gesture counted. He shook hands, looked like a man who had looked untouchable, but I knew better. Beneath the silk and gold, and I carried the proof of it. The bride entered soon. Gasps rose from as she stepped through the radiant in a gap that shimmered with a veil framed. Guests leaned, cameras flashed, capturing her. I watched her close. For a moment, my heart so hopeful, so sure, truly believed this day, and maybe for her it did. It was the end of she had chosen to buy, and that meant words of love. But as I listened, these vows were every word was a. I gripped the file in the weight of it. Together they still. There was a moment. Glanced at my brother, her eyes shimmering with tears. I wondered if she truly knew. I wondered if, in that moment, she was as much a victim as I had been. The thought stung, almost enough to weaken me. But then I remembered the secrets I had uncovered, the scandals her family had buried, the whispers of her own complicity. She wasn't innocent. None of them were. The ceremony moved forward, each moment dragging me closer to the edge. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, my breath shallow. I felt like an actor waiting in the wings. The audience already gathered, the stage set, the lights blazing. Soon it would be my turn to step forward. Soon perfection would fracture. The priest asked if anyone had cause to object. The silence that followed was thick, reverent. Every eye fixed on the couple, every breath held. My brother smiled, smug and victorious, convinced he had silenced every enemy. And that was when I rose from my. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers breaking out. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me. My brother's head snapped toward, confusion flickered. The bride froze, her bouquet for a heartbeat. And then, when the truth finally spilled, for a moment, the priest's question still hung in. If anyone has cause to. And I stood, the weight of my heart pounded so hard, but my hands did not shake. I gripped the file in my bag, the proof of every sin my brother, and I knew there was the church bells, but what came next were more devastating. I object, like glass, sound of whispers fall. The bride's bouquet. I stepped into the file was heavy. You don't know them. None of you do. The guests stirred, some leaning forward. My brother raised a hand as, this is enough. Sit down. But I didn't. I opened the file and held up the first command. This, I said, is proof of how he forged our father's will. Proof of how he stole my inheritance and humiliated me in front of this very family. He claimed what was not his, manipulated documents, and erased me from my father's legacy. Gasps. A ripple of murmurs surged through the pews. I saw an uncle shift uncomfortably, an aunt press her hand to her mouth. My brother's face reddened, his composure slipping. But I wasn't finished. And it didn't stop there. I continued, flipping to the next page. He didn't just steal from me, he stole from my father's company. He drained accounts, funneled money into shell businesses, signed fraudulent contracts. He paraded around as a successful businessman while he hollowed out the very empire. The whispers grew louder, harsher now. Words like fraud and liar hissed through the bride's face paled, her lips parting in disbelief. She looked at him, searching for reassurance, but he refused to meet. I spread the papers across the altar, letting them flutter down like, here is proof of his debts. While you toasted him, while you praised, he was stealing. The priest stepped back, his eyes wide, his voice lost. The guests were no longer. They were speaking openly now, voices overlapping. Is this true? What have we celebrated? The bride stumbled, petals scattered, her eyes filled with tears. Then at him, her voice break. Tell me it's not true. But my brother said nothing. His silence was louder than my. I pressed on, and there's more. He's not just a. He's a criminal. I pulled out the documents, the transactions, the evidence of law. My voice trembled with. He has blood on his hands. Dirty money flows. He has built everything you, and you all have worshipped him. The bride's family rose. Guests gasped. Others pointing, their voices rising. The once perfect, and in the center of it all, his mask shattered. For months he had silenced me, erased me. But now his lies were laid bare. His sins scattered across the altar. The smirk that once taunted me replaced by rage, fear, and something that almost looked like desperation. My voice grew steadier, louder, carried not just by anger but by vindication. You stole from me. You stole from our father. You stole from everyone who ever trusted you. And today, on the day you thought would crown your victory, the world sees you for what you are, a fraud, a thief, a coward. The bride's tears spilled freely now, streaking her makeup, her hands trembling as she stared at him. Her voice cracked, raw and desperate. Is it true? He finally spoke, his voice low and strained. It's lies. All of it. But the words sounded hollow, empty, and no one believed him. The cathedral was chaos, guests shouting, relatives demanding it, the bride's parents rising in fury. The perfect wedding had come, and I stood in the center of it, my heart pounding, but my spirit unbroken. For the first time in months, I was the truth teller, and yet, even as the chaos swelled, I had cracked his mask, exposed his lies, shattered his illusion. But I wasn't finished, because revenge isn't a single blow, storm that builds, wave after wave. But this was only... If he thought I was done, he was dead wrong. The cathedral was already in chaos, voices rising like waves crashing against stone. Guests shouted, relatives demanded answers, and the bride's tears stained the marble floor. My brother's mask had cracked, his lies exposed for all to see. But I wasn't finished. I hadn't come this far to stop halfway. I had one more weapon, one more truth, that would not just wound him, but end him. I tightened my grip on the file and felt the weight of the final piece of evidence inside. My heart pounded, my breath sharp, but my voice carried strong and clear when I spoke. You all think you know him, I said, my words cutting through the... But what I've shown you is only part of... There is something more, something even darker, and when you hear it, there will be no doubt left. He cannot escape. The room stilled slightly, curiosity breaking through. Even the bride lifted her tear-streaked, her trembling hands clutched. My brother's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight, his body taut like a cornered animal. He knew something was coming, he just didn't know what. I pulled out the final document, a copy of the overseas transfer pages that connected him not just to theft. This is proof that he, not just stealing, but laundering money for people you don't want to. Criminals, dangerous people, the kind of men who don't forgive debts, who don't tolerate. Gas filled the room. The bride's father surged to his face ashy. Is this true? My brother's composed, sweat beading. She's lying, he spat, his voice cracking with desperation. She's always been jealous, bitter. This is just another one of her games. But his words were weak, hollow, crumbling beneath. The guests weren't whispering. Eyes turned their backs. The bride's family looked. I spread the documents. Not a husband, not a man worthy of. He is a thief, a liar, a criminal who had every single one of you. The bride crumpled to the floor, her hands clutching. Her mother rushed to her face, a mask of fury as You've ruined her. You've ruined us all. And still, his silence screamed louder. Any denial. His reputation, once polished, admired, untouchable, lay in ruins at his feet. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the weight of his downfall settle over the room. The man who had stolen my inheritance, humiliated me, cast me out, had been stripped bare in front of everyone he sought to impress. He had nothing left but rage. His eyes locked on mine then, blazing with fury so intense it felt like fire. His face twisted, his hands clenched, his chest rising, and he wanted to strike. Not here, not with every witness in the room already seen, and that was the deepest. Not just that I had but that he was me crumble under. For months he had reveled in my... But now, the roles were now he was the one. His allies scattered, his friends slipped. The cathedral that had my voice low. You thought you could bury me, but all you did... And in his eyes I saw not surrender. As he glared at me, the wedding had ended not with vows. Guests had... The bride saw had set the fire. Some praised me for... But others, more than I cared to count, they claimed I had gone, that whatever sins he carried, they didn't care about. Lies, the fraud, the crimes. They cared about appearances, and I had shattered theirs. The isolation returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the crushing loneliness of betrayal. It was the wary solitude of someone who had chosen a path others couldn't follow. I was no longer the broken sister. I was something else, something harder, something people didn't quite know how to name. And yet, even with the whispers and the judgment, a strange sense of relief settled. For months I had carried the weight of silence. The humiliation was broken. The truth was out, my father's promises, but relief came hand in hand. I thought often of the bride, of the way her of the devastation. I had told myself that her family carried, but guilt has a way of whispering. What if she hadn't known the full truth? What if she had been another victim of his lies? Those questions haunted me, but in doing so, the wind rustled through. It only created. Still, I could. even if it left. One night, as I sat at my kitchen table, file still resting in it, his voice was low, urgent, carrying a weight that the words sent it. What do you mean? My grip tightened. He's talking to people. He says this isn't. He says he'll make you pay. The line went quiet, but the words echoed in my mind. Call ended. I sat in the silence of my apartment, my hands trembling, my heart pounding. I had thought I had ended it. I had thought the wedding was the final battlefield. But the war wasn't over. It was only changing shape. Then came news that chilled me. He wasn't gone for good. For the first time, I felt free. The air was different after the wedding. Not cleaner, not lighter, but freer. For months I had been drowning in silence, in humiliation, in the weight of betrayal that threatened to crush me. But now I could breathe again. The truth had been spoken, shouted even, and no one could erase it. I had torn down his mask, stripped away the lies, and in the ruins of that cathedral, I had reclaimed walking away from the wrecking through fire, and the whispers followed me, neighbors calling me bitter, relatives, but their words no. I had already faced, I had already been burned. Nothing they said now could my brother's reputation, and I had been the. But justice comes at a cost, and I carried that coffin of the bride, her broken voice, the way her dream had been a victim, and I had been the one to tear. I didn't regret exposing, and yet it felt stronger than I. Not as the forgotten. In the quiet days that followed, the autumn leaves turned into crimson and the air crisp with. I stood before them. They'll never erase. For a moment, and in that silence, not as a memory of, I began to rebuild my life. I reached out to relatives who had believed me, who had apologized, and though the bonds were fragile, they were real. I walked through the town with my head high again, not as the woman people pitied, but as the woman they whispered about. Some whispered with awe, others with disdain, but either way they whispered my name. The scars remained though, nights when I woke in a sweat, hearing his voice in my dream, days when doubt crept in, asking if I had gone too far, moments when I longed for the simplicity of childhood, before envy and greed turned love into. Revenge had freed me, but it had also marked me, and yet I wouldn't trade it back. Not for silence, not for peace built on lies, because freedom isn't about being unscarred. It's about choosing to live despite the scars. I knew my brother hated me more. I had seen it in his eyes as the chill around him, in the way his body trembled, in the glare that promised red. He had been ruined, but not destroyed, and men like him don't vanish quietly. The thought chilled me, but it didn't break me. If he wanted a war, then he would have one. I had faced him once, and as I stood once more before my mirror, I studied my reflection. The woman staring back wasn't the griever, the broken sister, the humiliated, a woman who had. The war had only. If you were in my place, would you have done the same or walked away? Tell me in the comments because I want to hear your. And if this story gripped you, make sure to like this video so more people see it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon because there are more stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice. Share this video with someone who loves a good twist because trust me, this is only the beginning.